So I'm David Holt. I'm Professor of Bioanalytics at St George's, University of London. I think the main challenge for a physician in Europe, let's put it down into that context at the moment, is that for many formulations there are a lot of generic formulations, so that you might go from one formulation to another of the same drug. And what has happened is that physicians have lost control of what they're actually prescribing. In most settings, you will have to prescribe the generic formulation of the drug. So you cannot specify the formulation of the drug. And then you have no idea what your patients have actually received, which of several formulations they might have got. I myself, for instance, take 2 generic formulations a day. And when I go back to have the prescriptions refilled from one time to another, I will mostly get a different manufactured formulation of the same drug. Now, the problem there is that although these have all been manufactured to a high standard and have gone through a generic approval process whereby they are shown bioequivalent to a reference formulation, they may not themselves be equivalent to one another. So one generic formulation may fall below the reference and another might fall above. And if we go from one formulation to the other, that might involve delivering more or less of the drug. In some clinical settings, that can be a problem if they are narrow therapeutic index drugs where small changes in exposure to the drug result from taking the formulation. An example might be warfarin, for instance, where it's been shown on a number of occasions now that if you change from one formulation to another, overall healthcare costs can increase because the number of interventions that have to be made because of differences in exposure causes a rise in the overall healthcare costs. I think that's the main problem that faces physicians relating to the use of generic formulations. So in Europe, and we have a similar situation in America, the regulatory authorities are trying to look at the total manufacture of the drug, the complete supply chain for both the active pharmaceutical ingredient, the bit that does the work, the drug, and the excipients that go into the tablet, the capsule, or the liquid formulation. In Europe, we have the European Medicines Directive on Falsified Medicines. What that is attempting to do is to say, if you buy in from outside the European community, the active pharmaceutical ingredient or the excipients, they must be manufactured to the same standards of good manufacturing practice as if they had been made within the European Union. And there are adequate guidelines on how this should be done, both in terms of what should happen at the manufacturing plant and what inspectors should look for when they are inspecting formulations. But of course, regulations are only as good as their observance at the point of manufacture and the way they are enforced by the regulator. So we have to ensure that the manufacturers are doing their job and the regulators are doing theirs. Within the EU, I think that most, by far the majority of preparations are manufactured to a good quality. But we need constant vigilance, and we've had a number of instances over the last decade where substandard medications have got into the supply chain, which is now a very complicated supply chain. Most of the active pharmaceutical ingredient is manufactured outside the EU. Around about 80% is manufactured either in China or in India. So the potential for having people bypassing the regulations, not keeping to those regulations is very great. And that's what we've got to try to overcome. Yes, I'm often asked if generic formulations are all the same in terms of efficacy and safety with respect to the originator formulation, the one that was first into field. I think the thing you have to understand for the generic regulations, so the procedure you go through when you produce a generic medication, is that they do not look at safety and efficacy. That is not part of the generic process. We have a process whereby we show bioequivalence for solid dose formulations. Liquid formulations don't have to show that, only that they are the same drug in the same dose. So those aspects are not looked at, and one of the underlying assumptions of generic medication is that bioequivalence equals therapeutic equivalence. And that is not always the case, and a number of studies have shown, in particular for some of the narrow therapeutic index drugs, for instance anti-epileptics, immunosuppressives, that very small differences in exposure, those that are well within the guidelines for bioequivalence, are not adequate for interchangeability when we come to look at moving from one formulation to another, in particular going backwards and forwards between generic formulations.